What is the meaning of the life we doctors so constantly try to protect? And how ought that life be lived? With what ideals and aspirations? With what accommodations, adjustments, and compromises? In the face of the world's constantly pressing opportunities, frustrations, and obstacles. I'd like to thank the Mid-America Orthopedic Association and Rob for inviting me here tonight. It's an honor to give the Steele Lecture, and it carries responsibilities that I don't take lightly. The words I opened with were taken from an essay by Robert Coles entitled, "Why Novels and Poems in Our Medical Schools?" It helps frame for us one of the central goals I have in giving this talk, to demonstrate the role literature can play in helping doctors deal with, understand, and enjoy the practice of medicine. It's been several months since Rob asked me to give this talk, and a few weeks after he had asked me, I was sitting at home in front of the laptop jotting down a few thoughts about what I would say. It was Christmas time, and the college kids were home, and they saw me working at the computer, and they said, "Dad, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm giving a talk in a few months." "A talk? Where is it? What is it? When is it? Florida? Can I come? What's the drinking age?" Hopefully you'll find more of this talk than something that will drive you to drink. I'm going to talk about the intersection between literature and medicine. This is an area that has intrigued me for years. I wanted to be a writer even before I wanted to be a doctor. My career as a writer actually began several years before my career as a doctor. I suppose many of you wish that a talk like this would be given by some brilliant luminary from the literary field, Colin McCann or Michael Ondaatje or Ian McEwan or Alice Munro, and I wish it was too, but I'd love to hear what a brilliant author would have to say about the topic of literature and medicine. Interestingly, I have heard a couple famous authors, Abraham Verghese and Ethan Kanan, are both physicians and have talked on this subject, and I have incorporated some of their thoughts into my talk. So you don't get a Pulitzer Prize winner, you don't get a Booker Prize winner, you get a guy famous neither as an orthopedic surgeon or as an author. But in my own defense, let me tell you that I have thought a lot about this topic, and I hope that tonight I'll be able to entertain, encourage, and even edify you a little bit. I've written 2 books, as Rob mentioned. The first one, Blue Collar, Blue Scrubs, was about my days as a construction worker trying to get into medical school. And then Hot Lights, Cold Steel, about my days as an ortho resident and inveterate moonlighter at the Mayo Clinic. Neither of those books ever made it to the New York Times bestseller list, but they remain in print and continue to sell reasonably well. Both are on the required reading list at a number of medical schools, and both continue to serve one of the primary purposes that I had in writing the book, which was to encourage young people to go into medicine. A third book, this one fiction with a medical theme, will, I hope, be published sometime in the next year or so. I begin this talk with a little trepidation because it's intimidating to speak to a group of orthopedic surgeons. We all here tonight are aware of the unflattering, scurrilous stereotypes of orthopedic surgeons perpetuated by jealous medical specialists. One of those stereotypes concerns the large retinue that accompanies us to the OR, supposedly the inordinate number of medical reps that are often needed in each case. This phenomenon has caused our colleagues to pose the question, what does the orthopod say to his or her spouse before they hop into bed? Answer, where do you want the reps to stand? We surgeons find our minds occupied with a myriad of tasks. We are almost inescapably pragmatic. We do that which gets results. How else could we have managed to accomplish so much? And yet, don't we all feel sometimes that we have left something behind? Something important? Aren't there things that we should be taking time to contemplate slowly in front of a fire at night? Things that are not in the least pragmatic? Things that seem to profit us little? Don't we all suspect that somewhere deep within us is a buried life of which we know next to nothing? Literature can put our feet back on that track. Here is an excerpt from a poem by Matthew Arnold. His thoughts are every bit as relevant today as when he wrote them 150 years ago. Often in the world's most crowded streets, often in the din of strife, there rises an unspeakable desire after the knowledge of our buried life, a thirst to spend our fire and restless force in tracking out our true original course, a longing to inquire into the mystery of this heart which beats so wild and so deep in us, to know whence our lives come and where they go. And many a man in his own breast then delves, but deep enough, alas, none ever minds. And we have been on many thousand lines, and we have shown on each spirit and power, but hardly have we for one little hour been on our own line, have we been ourselves. hardly had skill to utter one of all the nameless feelings that course through our breast. But they course on, forever unexpressed. And long we try in vain to seek and act our hidden self. And what we say and do is eloquent, is well, but 'tis not true. And then we will no more be racked with inward striving, and demand of all the thousand nothings of the hour their stupefying power. Ah, yes, and they benumb us at our call. Yet still, from time to time, vague and forlorn, from the soul's subterranean depth, upborne as from an infinitely distant land, come airs and floating echoes, and convey a melancholy into all our day. While medicine and literature may seem to be wildly disparate subjects, I hope to demonstrate to you tonight the natural affinity between these two disciplines. It's also my hope to show you the many things literature has to offer physicians and to initiate or rekindle a desire in all of you to read. Earlier this year, the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery published an article entitled, "What to Read and How to Read It." I realized that this was a well-meaning attempt to help orthopods choose articles relevant to their field and help them decide which ones to read. But I was nevertheless dismayed after reading the article. At no point was the reading of non-medical texts mentioned or encouraged. Of course we must read scientific journals, and of course we must read scientific texts, but I'll tell you what I've told pre-med students when I'm invited to speak at their institutions. I learned more about being a good doctor from William Shakespeare and Virginia Woolf and William Butler Yeats than I ever did from Campbell's Operative Orthopedics or JBJS. From Campbell's and JBJS, I learned the critical technical skills without which I could never have hoped to become a competent orthopedic surgeon. But there is so much more to being a good doctor and a good surgeon than knowing how and where to cut. As doctors, we deal with people, and we deal with them in an inherently unequal situation. We have skills that they do not. We have knowledge that they do not. We have experience that they do not. And yet, patients don't come to us so that we can hand down edicts and issue orders. They come because they are hurting and because we have professed our willingness and ability to help them. How we deal with patients is ultimately the true measure of a good doctor. How do we demonstrate competence without showing arrogance? How do we show imperfections without instilling doubt? How do we show empathy without losing objectivity? How do we deliver bad news when only good news is expected? Let me propose to you that literature can help answer those questions. We are doctors. Our profession has its own stylized, precise vocabulary, but the precise language of science is never quite sufficient to fully encompass the totality of illness. For example, your grandfather has hip arthritis. ICD-10 code M16.11, while accurate and precise, does not really connect you to the suffering of this man that you love. Whereas words like, "I heard his low, quiet moans this morning as he tried to get out of bed," do. Haven't we come closer to expressing the truth when we use such literary terms rather than the precise medical ones? Robert Coles reminds us that our sense of morality in medicine is ultimately grounded in the persuasive power of stories of helping and healing, not in the clarity of our thinking about principles. The parable of the Good Samaritan is to the principle of beneficence as Fort Knox is to the quarter. It's the narrative power of the parable that makes it compelling. That is, the knitting together of events, motives, and actions which together form a story. If we had to choose a moral to the story of the Good Samaritan, I suppose we would say its beneficence is good. But why is the parable of the Good Samaritan so much more memorable, so much more vivid, so much more truth-telling than merely saying beneficence is good? It's because it is a story, and the nuances of the story reveal more to us than the dry recitation of fact or opinion. We can say that family practitioners are timid, that internists are paralyzed by thought, and that surgeons are rash. Or we can tell a story, an old familiar story, about the family practice doc, the internist, the surgeon, and the pathologist who go duck hunting. They're warned that it's duck season only and they can only shoot ducks. A flock of ducks flies by, family practice doc raises his shotgun, says, "Looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, hangs around with other ducks, but I can't be sure." So he lowers his rifle. The internist gets up and says, "Winged creature, waterfowl, Rule out ostrich, rule out penguin, rule out flamingo. I'll get CT scan and DNA analysis. And he lowers his gun. The surgeon steps up, blasts at everything he has, unloads, reloads, fires again, reloads, fires. He shoots everything he's got, totally out of bullets. He turns to the pathologist and says, "Go see if that's a duck." If you think medicine deals only in harsh reality and disdains metaphor, listen to Cynthia Ozick. Physicians are abundantly given to metaphorical speech and thought. They live every hour under the raucous wing of the angel of death and crippling, whose devastating imagery they cannot deny, and whose symbols they read cell by cell, X-ray by X-ray. Ambiguity and interpretation are ineluctably in the grain of their tasks. All medical literature, however hidden in obscure vocabularies in abstruse journals, is, case after case, a literature of redemption through parable. New cases remember old cases. Or as Colin McCann has reminded us, we are built on the wounds and mercies of the past. More and more medical pre-med programs and medical schools are recognizing the important role literature can play in the formation of a well-rounded physician. Most medical schools in the United States now require, or at least offer as an elective, courses in literature or the humanities. Georgetown Medical School has a 4-year track in literature and medicine. Yale Med School has a course in writing. Brown Med School has a course in medical humanities. New York University Med School has LitMed, a literature, arts, and medicine database. The Maine Humanities Council has a program for medical personnel entitled Literature and Medicine, Humanities at the Heart of Healthcare, that has been instituted in over 25 states. Over a century ago, William Osler, perhaps the most famous physician of the 20th century, convinced of the importance of literature in a physician's life, urged young doctors not to be satisfied with professional training alone. He composed a list of 10 books that he encouraged them not only to read, but to actually keep at their bedside. What are the 10 books? The Old and New Testament, Shakespeare, Montaigne, Plutarch's Lives, Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, Religio Medici, Don Quixote, Emerson, and Oliver Wendell Holmes' breakfast table stories. I dare say that not many of us have read even half of those books. There is a growing recognition of the fact that we physicians carry with us our own set of biases, prejudices, and preconceptions that often interfere with our ability not only to relate to our patients, but to make objective decisions about them. Our pursuit of objectivity, so it is said, has led us to become too detached, too unable to appreciate the subjective milieu in which our patients live, unable to grasp the context and meaning of illness in our patients' lives. Literature, by exposing us to other views, other sensibilities, can broaden our ability to understand and to empathize with and to ultimately help our patients. Lest you think that the salutary effects of literature upon the physician are a matter of opinion, let me tell you that this has actually been studied scientifically. A study in Science magazine by Kidd and Castano in 2013 performed 5 experiments that demonstrated that reading literary fiction improves ability to identify and understand others' subjective states. In other words, it helps you become more empathetic, an especially important skill for physicians. Literature changes how, not just what, people think about others. And literature can help us not just with our patients, but with ourselves. Medicine abounds with ambiguities, and the improper resolution of these ambiguities can take a large emotional toll on the doctor. We are the people patients turn to when they have problems with morbidity and mortality. We can, in some cases, postpone our mortality, but we can never do what the patient ultimately desires, to eliminate it. This conflict is at the heart of every doctor-patient encounter, no matter how quotidian or banal. The hangnail, the sore back, the torn meniscus, they are all presentiments of the last reality. As physicians, we are faced with the dual challenge of treating in our patients that which cannot be cured and being constantly reminded through our patients' morbidity of the imminence of our own demise. Abraham Verghese laments that doctors today have become so wrapped up in technology that the patient in the bed has become an icon for the patient in the computer. The scan, the labs, the x-rays, sometimes we think everything we need, everything important, everything germane is in the computer. This fact was driven home to me recently with one of my own patients. I do the history and physical on all my patients who are having minor outpatient procedures. And this patient was an old friend of mine, actually lived down the street from us, and his kids are the same age as my kids. He had a typical carpal tunnel, symptoms in his EMG confirmed it. So I was listening to his heart, and I retained some of the fascination I have with cardiology that I did as a resident med student. What kind of systolic murmur is that? And is that an S4 or is it a split S1? But when I listened to Jerry's heart, he had the loudest murmur I think I've ever heard. And my eyes bugged out, and all I knew for sure is this guy needs to see a cardiologist. So I called one of my cardiology friends in the local group, got him in to see him the next day. And imagine my dismay when later that week I ran into the cardiologist in the hallway at the hospital. And I said, "What do you think about that loud murmur?" And he shrugged it off as unimportant. "I don't know," he said. "It was loud, I guess, so I got an echo." I'm not about to tell a cardiologist how to do his job, and in a very real sense, he was right. What difference does it make what he thought of the murmur? Auscultation lets you guess what the problem might be. An echo will tell you for sure what it is. But when you shortchange the patient-physician interaction, when you eliminate the laying on of hands, when your PA does everything but operate, doesn't something get lost in the process? I mentioned earlier that I'm near completion of my third book. At the end of the book, the narrator, himself a physician, is in an emergency room dying of injuries suffered in a plane crash. He has grown close to the young, insecure intern who has been caring for him for the last several hours. As he watches her, he muses. She thinks she is not a good doctor because she hasn't memorized enough textbooks, hasn't perfected enough techniques, hasn't performed enough surgeries. She is so painfully aware of what she lacks, but she forgets that what we long for when we are sick, grievously sick, mortally sick, is not a cure. We know it's too late for that. What we long for is a healing, an assurance that the human connection that seems about to be dissolved forever can somehow bridge the deep chasm we are about to cross. Scalpels can't affect that. Textbooks can't teach it. But compassion, the simple, unaffected love of our fellow man can. The knowledge that someone cares, that we are not alone. Gestures, touches, smiles. There are some primitive aspects of medicine that are still valid. There are rituals in which both the patient and the doctor have a role. Rituals are about transformation. There is a ritualistic aspect when a person meets a doctor and bares his soul and then bares his body, letting the doctor touch him in ways that no one else in society is allowed to. This is not just an examination, it's a ritual. And if the doctor shortchanges the ritual, he shortchanges the transformation. The ritual is about the one message that physicians need to convey to their patient. It is unchanged since antiquity. And it tells the patient that you will care for him, that you will never abandon him, and that you will always be there for him. Medicine is a science, an orderly discipline, an exercise in logic. We gather facts, and from those facts we make deductions. Young adult with right lower quadrant pain, high white count, fever, appendicitis. Middle-aged male, postprandial, shoveling snow, develops crushing substernal chest pain, myocardial infarction. Young female athlete lands awkwardly, twists her knee, feels a pop. Knee swells and becomes unstable, ACL tear. The CT scan confirms appendicitis. The EKG confirms myocardial infarction. The MRI scan confirms ACL tear. That's all we need to know, right? Or is it? Every human action exists within a larger framework of myth and metaphor. And to deny medical events their mythic or metaphoric components is to fail to fully understand the patient, the event, and life itself. As James Preston has written, for thousands of years, the practice of medicine has been lodged in the context of mythopoetic worldviews. Human response to illness, even in complex societies, remains undetached from its deeper, more ancient origins. Despite explosive technological medical advances, somehow individuals remain connected to an older conception of healing, one that defies mechanistic reductions and interprets illness within a metaphorical frame of reference. Your 3-week-old baby develops a fever. You take him to the emergency room in the middle of the night. What do you fear? What do you want? To say that you fear otitis media and you want antibiotics is too facile. There's too much going on there. This isn't just some anonymous human being. It's your child. What does it mean to be a father or mother? What duties does it impose? What does illness in a nascent human being signify? What other dancers might be casting shadows on the wall of your subconscious as you carry that precious little bundle through the doors into the emergency room? The framework is what matters. It's not that the mythic component of illness is the only component. The reality, the inflamed eardrum, the ruptured ligament, the septic vestigial pouch, the hypoxic myocardium, is not to be denied. But again, as Preston has said, all the realities that we perceive to be concrete and incontestable are heavily imbued with the stuff of fiction. While we may at times consider our surface perceptions of the physical world to be ultimately real, something reminds us that even those are approximations of a deeper invisible reality, understandable only through metaphors and the mythopoetic dimension of the human imagination. I don't want to get too New Age weird on you, but I think these observers have a valid point. Patients come to us with a story. We ask them to tell us their story, and we call it a medical history. Traditional paradigmatic Western medical thinking interprets this narrative and fits it into prefabricated templates from which we doctors can extract objective data. This formulaic approach winnows subtleties into certainties, makes every gray a black or white, and often reframes the patient's need in a way that facilitates the doctor in making a diagnosis, but frustrates the patient from receiving what she truly needs, a need of which the patient herself is often unaware. In transforming the patient's story into a boilerplated medical history, we run the risk of losing sight of the real problem. A satisfactory resolution of that problem may well require listening to the subtlety of the story with its emphasis on symbols, rather than the certitudes of the medical history. For stories are more than dry recitation of fact. Stories are always, to some degree, metaphoric. Stories are instructive. They are didactic. It's not just what happened. It's what it means. This is no less true of medical stories. Even Susan Sontag, one writer who eschews the notion of illness as metaphor, still admits that it is hardly possible to take up one's residence in the kingdom of the ill unprejudiced by the lurid metaphors with which it has been landscaped. Literature offers us a way to dig down away from symbols and help us focus on the patient in the bed, not the patient in the computer. Focusing on the computer leads to solving problems. Focusing on the patient leads to helping people. Am I playing some sort of semantic game? Isn't solving problems the only way that we really help our patients? Do we really need to get all touchy-feely? Holding her hand isn't going to make our patient's knee feel better. Can't we just do what the patient asks and take out the damned meniscus? Can't we just do what the patient asks? The assumption here is that the patient is asking us to take out her meniscus, when in fact what she is asking is that we get rid of her pain, or, going deeper, that we make her whole, or deeper still, that we allay her dread. Simply excising 28% of the medial meniscus will indeed suffice for some, perhaps most, but certainly not all of our patients. Literature can help us not just solve these dilemmas, but also teach us how to recognize that such dilemmas even exist. It can help us see beneath the surface of the naive requests, the conflicting desires, the impossible demands that our patients sometimes make of us. It can help us to discern what they really want and what prompts their unusual behavior. What is the connection between literature and medicine? Edmund Pellegrino says that medicine and literature are both ways of looking at man, and both are at heart moral enterprises. Both must start by seeing life bare, without averting their gaze. Yet neither can rest in mere looking. To be authentic, they must look feelingly, with compassion. Medicine without compassion is mere technicism, curing without healing. Literature without feeling is mere reporting, experience without meaning. He goes on to say that medicine and literature are united in an unremitting paradox, the need simultaneously to stand back from and yet to share in the struggle of human life. They must see clearly, but they must also be involved in the outcome of the struggle. Each thus becomes a moral experience. The list of physician authors is long and illustrious. Anton Chekhov, who once famously declared that medicine was his lawful wife and literature his mistress. William Carlos Williams, Arthur Conan Doyle, John Keats, Somerset Maugham, Francois Rabelais. In our own time, Richard Selzer, Oliver Sacks, Atul Gawande, Abraham Verghese. Why do so many doctors choose to write? And why are they so often successful? I think part of the reason is that both doctors and writers need to see things and see them in a way that others do not. As doctors, we are used to putting ourselves in our patient's place. We must listen to their stories. We must empathize with their pain. In the end, we must become one with them. Writers do the same thing. They see the story behind the facts, and they allow us to see the truth behind the story. Put another way, they write about things, about facts, but they weave these facts into a story. The reader, often without even realizing it, dissects the story, and from the story gleans the truth. I'll give you an example from a story that actually happened here in Florida last week. An elderly man who owns a farm a few miles east of here, east of Bonita Springs, has a big farm with a pond in the back. And the pond is fixed up with nice picnic tables and a horseshoe court and some orange trees and grapefruit trees. And he decided last week that he hadn't been down to the pond in a while and he wanted to go check it out and see how things were. So he grabbed a 5-gallon bucket. He was going to get some fruit when he was down there and bring it back. As he neared the pond, he heard splashing and several female voices laughing hysterically. As he came closer, he saw that it was a bunch of naked young women skinny dipping in his pool, in his pond. Upon seeing him, the women immediately went to the deep end of the pond and shouted to him, "Go away, we're not coming out until you leave." The old man shrugged his shoulders. "You ladies do what you want." Then he held up the bucket and said, "I'm just here to feed the alligators." In his brilliant short story, The Exact Location of the Soul, Richard Selzer addressed the issue of why a surgeon should write. Is it vanity that urges him? There is glory enough in the knife. Is it for money? One can make too much money. No, it is to search for some meaning in the ritual of surgery, which is at once murderous, painful, healing, and full of love. It is a devilish hard thing to transmit, to find even. Perhaps if one were to cut out a heart, a lobe of the liver, a single convolution of the brain, and paste it to a page, it would speak with more eloquence than all the words of Balzac. Such a piece would need no literary style, no massive erudition or history, but in its very shape and feel would tell all the frailty and strength, the despair and nobility of man. I have come to believe, he said, that it is the flesh alone that counts. The rest is that with which we distract ourselves when we are not hungry or cold, in pain or in ecstasy. In the recesses of the body, I search for the philosopher's stone. I know it is there, hidden in the deepest, dampest cul-de-sac. It awaits discovery. To find it would be like the harnessing of fire. It would illuminate the world. Another connection between medicine and literature is in the area of semiotics, or signs. The interpretation of signs is key in both disciplines. We start on the surface with signs and try to understand what the signs mean. In orthopedics, we start with signs, positive Lachmans, absent ankle jerk, weakness of the APB, and we proceed to make a diagnosis. Similarly, in literature, we start with signs. The suddenly over-solicitous husband, the dark and stormy night, the bumbling detective, and we proceed to draw conclusions. Note that especially in literature, the road from outer sign to inner meaning is not one of pure logic. It is not a matter of if A, then B. Much of the enjoyment of literature comes from the reader exercising her own intelligence to render the meaning of the text, a meaning which is not necessarily universal. Two intelligent readers may reach different conclusions as to the same text meaning. Think Gregor Samsa in Kafka's short story Metamorphosis, or many of the heroines in Jane Austen novels. And of course, the whole relationship between text and meaning has been turned on its head by the deconstructionists who would question whether or not any text has a true universal meaning. What can we as physicians ask of literature? I think we can ask two things. How can literature help me as a doctor? And how can literature help me as a person? How can literature help me be a better doctor? Literature teaches the physician something of the significance of symbol and language. Language is the instrument of diagnosis and therapy, the vehicle through which the patient's needs are expressed and the doctor's advice is conveyed. Understanding the nuances of language, its cultural and ethnic variations, and its symbolic content are as essential as any skills the clinician may possess. Pellegrino says that literature lays open for view the moral dilemmas, conflicts, triumphs, and failings of human beings. The aspiring physician needs to be sensitized to the complexities of the moral context in which his advice is given or judgments of his patient's behavior are rendered. Secondly, literature is not merely a way of understanding the meaning of something, but can be a broader, more capacious portrayal that gives us both the essential and the peripheral, that sees not just the symptoms, but inscribes medicine and suffering within the life and even within the death of a person. Thirdly, as Banks has told us, literature offers the centuries-deep reservoir of arresting life interpretations focused in poem and play, short story and saga. The sufferer and the carer, their visions blurred and narrowed by the constricting world of illness, can gain a broader, deeper world view through the wide-angle lenses provided by great writers. Literature can remind us of the beauty and the nobility of this profession that drew us to it back when we were just kids, dreaming of the desire to be of service to our fellow human men. How can literature help me be a better person? There are, of course, many non-utilitarian benefits of literature for the physician, including the service that literature renders for all human beings, enhancement of the experience of life itself. Literature takes the physician from the grinding reality of the clinic into realms of imagination, lyricism, and drama. It provides for those moments of delectation without which the soul shrivels. Literature gives meaning to what the physician sees and makes him see it feelingly. Dana Gioia, poet and former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, has stated that modern life forces us to shut down our humanity for most of the day. But the more you shut down your humanity, the lesser a person you become. The arts help us to regain humanity, the humanity that we so often suppress. The human purpose of art is to awaken and develop the fullness of our human potential. Art, he says, is the language by which we understand the world. Medical stories are about three things: illness, injury, and senescence. We get sick, we get hurt, we get old. The resolution of these conflicts is the medical story of our lives. Physical infirmity of whatever sort is a distillation of our ultimate fate and a reminder of the existential paradox with which man must struggle, to wit, that we are thinking, loving, breathing, laughing people, and in a few years we will be dust. Modern literature has tackled this issue with frankness, but without offering the reader any sense of salvation. As Campbell says, it is devoted in great measure to a courageous, open-eyed observation of the sickeningly broken figurations that abound before us, around us, and within. But where modern literature fails is in showing us the possibility of transcendence. We are fated to die, and we don't like it. But what are we to do when faced with such knowledge? We can deny it, which is what escapist fiction does. It looks at man's fate, rebels against it, and says, no. We can resign ourselves to it, which is what modern literature does, which looks at man's fate, concedes its inevitability, and says, yes, alas. Or we can transcend it, which is what mythology does, when looking at man's fate and says, yes, but. Since there is no denying the end to which we are all fated, most people choose not to confront but to ignore it. We, go about our daily lives as though this terrible dilemma does not exist. Or, as Soren Kierkegaard has observed, we tranquilize ourselves with the trivial. Kierkegaard's words hit home with me. I like to golf, and I wondered, is that what I'm doing when I play golf? Am I tranquilizing myself with the trivial? I puzzled over this until one day I happened to read a heart-wrenching letter in the Dear Abby column that made me rethink the way that I spend my free time. I'd like to read that letter to you now. Dear Abby, I have never written to you before, but I have no one else to turn to, and I really need your advice. You see, I have suspected for some time now that my wife has been cheating on me. There are the usual signs. Phone rings, but if I answer, the caller hangs up. More and more late nights at the office. More and more going out with the girls. Although when I ask their names, she always says, just some friends from work, you don't know them. I try to stay awake and look out for her when she comes home, but I usually fall asleep. Anyway, I've never broached the subject with my wife. I've been too afraid. I think deep down, I just did not want to know the truth. But last night, she went out again, and I finally decided to check on her. Around midnight, I went out to the garage and hid behind my golf clubs so I could get a good view of the whole street when she arrived home from what she said was a night out with the girls. When she got out of the car, her face was flushed, her hair in disarray. She buttoned up her blouse, took her panties out of her purse, and slipped them on. It was at that moment, crouching behind my clubs, that I noticed a hairline crack where the shaft meets the hosel on my new Callaway driver. Is this something I can fix myself, or should I bring it back to the pro shop where I bought it? As doctors, we can never fully understand our patient's pain. Why do some people complain bitterly of arthritic knee pain when others with much worse x-rays do not? Why do some people ignore chest pain and die at home without treatment, while others are in the emergency room 2 or 3 times a year with complaints of pain that no one can ever justify? Why do we know sometimes beyond a shadow of a doubt before we even make the incision that Mrs. Smith is going to have a lot of pain post-op? Literature can be especially helpful when it comes to understanding pain. Pain is the physical experience most resistant to scientific classification. The precise language of science fails us when it comes to pain. Pain cannot be adequately described, nor can it be adequately defined. We cannot see it, we cannot touch it, we cannot measure it. As Elaine Scarry said in her landmark work, The Body in Pain, pain comes unsharably into our midst as at once that which cannot be denied and that which cannot be confirmed. Whatever pain achieves, it achieves in part through its unsharability, and it ensures this unsharability through its resistance to language. English, writes Virginia Woolf, which can express the thoughts of Hamlet and the tragedy of Lear, has no words for the shiver or the headache. The merest schoolgirl, when she falls in love, has Shakespeare or Keats to speak her mind for her. But let a sufferer try to describe a pain in his head to a doctor, and language at once runs dry. Through literature, we can come to a partial understanding of pain. And even then, no writer can adequately render a description of pain itself, but must content herself with a description of its effect on the sufferer. Think Tolstoy and the death throes of Ivan Ilyich, or Sophocles and the agony of Philoctetes. Here is a nurse's description of Mr. Johnson's pain. Patient states his pain is a 10. Here is Leo Tolstoy's description of Ivan Ilyich's pain. From that moment, the screaming began that continued for 3 days and was so awful that one could not hear it through closed doors 2 rooms away without horror. Which description seems more evocative? Our patients often make impossible demands on us. They don't know what they're asking, we sometimes tell ourselves. In his short story, Darkness, Anton Chekhov describes a young peasant, Kirilla, who comes to the home of the prison doctor, asking him to let his brother out of jail. The doctor indignantly, impatiently, and quite logically responds that he is just the doctor. He's not the warden. He's not the jailer. He has no power to let anyone out of jail. The peasant goes on to explain that his brother has been imprisoned unjustly, that no one will listen, that the family will starve if he's not let out. The doctor repeats that he has nothing to do with any of this. He is just a doctor. Go to the authorities, he tells the peasant. Here's how Kafka ends the story. 5 days later, as the doctor was on his way home after seeing his patients, he caught sight of Kirilla again in his yard. This time, the young peasant was not alone, but with a gaunt, very pale old man who nodded his head without ceasing, like a pendulum, and mumbled with his lips. "Your Honor," the old man hissed in his throat, raising his eyebrows, "be merciful. We are poor people. We cannot repay your honor, but if you graciously please, Karushka or Vashka can repay you in work. Let them work. We will pay you with work, said Kirilla, and he raised his hand above his head as though taking an oath. Let him go. They are starving, crying night and day, your honor. The young peasant bent a rapid glance on his father, pulled him by the sleeve, and both of them, as at the word of command, fell at the doctor's feet. The latter waved his hand in despair and, without looking round, walked quickly in at his door. Note that the doctor's response at the end was not irritation, not frustration, not anger, but despair. He understood what prompted the request, the unfairness, the helplessness, the desperation, and he all too fully understood the futility of it all and his own impotence to do that which was asked of him. I would like to close tonight by calling upon literature to perform one last service for us this evening, to draw around us the cloak of understanding, to remind us of the reason that ultimately we do what we do, and to describe for us the promise and the solace those of us who call ourselves surgeons. From Richard Selzer, Lessons from the Art. The surgeon learns that love can bloom in the stoniest desert. It is precisely this hell in which we wage our lives that offers us the energy, the possibility to care for each other. A surgeon does not slip from his mother's womb with compassion smeared upon him like the drippings of his birth. It is much later that it comes. No easy shaft of grace this. The cumulative murmuring of the numberless wounds he has dressed, the incisions he has made, all the sores and ulcers and cavities he has touched in order to heal. In the beginning, it is merely audible, a whisper as from many mouths. Slowly it gathers, rises from the streaming flesh, until at last it is a pure calling, an exclusive sound like the cry of certain solitary birds, telling that out of the resonance between the sick man and the one who tends him, there may spring that profound courtesy that the religious call love. Thank you.